So welcome all of you in the third lecture of our series, The Elusive Shape of the Platonic Tradition. And today our speaker will be Jeffrey Hipolito, and the subject will be Owen Barfield. So the first lecture delivered by Kevin Corrigan was a comparative take on Plotinus and ancient Greek philosophy and Chinese philosophy, Taoism. Uh, then the second lecture was by John Vervaeke, who talked about contemporary cognitive science and psychology in light of the Platonic and especially Neoplatonic tradition. So today we have a very different perspective, but I think a very interesting and important one, namely uh, literature and poetry, as I indicated in my remarks at the beginning of the first lecture, that it's not only about philosophy. The Platonic tradition is not only about philosophy, it's also about art, about poetry, and literature, of course, and religion and religious experience. So today we will listen to the lecture Owen Barfield, the Poet-Platonist, and it will be delivered by one of the eminent specialists on Owen Barfield, Jeffrey Hipolito, who is also president of the Owen Barfield Society. Uh, and he recently published two books, this year published. He published two books on Owen Barfield. First one is entitled Owen Barfield's Poetic Philosophy, Meaning and Imagination, and it was published with Bloomsbury. And the second one is Owen Barfield's Poetry, Drama, and Fiction, Writers on Pegasus. It was published with Routledge. So one book is dedicated more to Barfield's philosophy, although it's a poetic philosophy, and the other book is dedicated more to his purely literary works, um, because there are those two strands in Barfield's work. But I'm sure that Jeffrey will say a little bit more about Barfield, who is still not a very widely known and maybe not a very popular thinker and writer. So he will talk more about Barfield himself and his oeuvre, and about the Platonic dimension of his writings. So, Jeff, the floor is
Perfect.
yours.
Yes, exactly. Good. Yeah, you've really hit on all the topics there. Yeah, so I'll just dive in. So let me begin by expressing my thanks to Mateusz and to Adam Mickiewicz University for this opportunity to speak to and with you here today. It is a great honor to be a part of this wonderful series and to be in the company of so many extraordinary thinkers and scholars. My topic today is Owen Barfield as Poet-Platonist. I realize that some of you may not know who Owen Barfield is, and so may wonder why anyone should wish to participate in a discussion of his work. Let me begin then with a brief overview of Barfield's career before going on to the relation of his thinking to the Platonic tradition broadly conceived, and then to one of the ways in which he extended that tradition with great originality, his discovery of the evolution of consciousness. Running like Alf, the sacred river beneath my whole talk will be the way in which Barfield anticipates the recently renewed interest in the meaning crisis. Anticipates it, not merely in the contemporary forms put forward by Jonathan Haidt, John Vervaeke, and others, but even in earlier forms explored by Viktor Frankl and the existentialists beginning in the 1940s. This theme will flow silently beneath most of my talk, but will rise to the surface and become explicit near the end. That will also be the moment when the poet half of Poet-Platonist becomes clear, as we shall see that the rediscovery of meaning hinges on a full appreciation of the figurative essence of language, even when we mean by meaning not its connection to language, but the looser sense of what it is to live a meaningful life. I hope to show in this way not only that Barfield speaks to our time in ways that continue to be relevant, or in ways that anticipate the questions that we have lately come to see as most pressing, but in ways that even now we have not quite envisaged clearly. When asked, Barfield sometimes said that his deepest concern was with the essence of language. This was his way of yoking together his two primary vocations as poet and philosopher. He practiced both of them side by side through his long career. Barfield was born in 1898 and died 99 years later in 1997. He was a teenager when he published his first poem in 1917, and 23 in 1921 when his first essay appeared in print. He published his final major essays roughly 70 years later in the 1980s. During his century-spanning career, he published a dozen books, and after his death, a number of previously unpublished poems, plays, short stories, and novellas have appeared, with more still to come, including a major novel, English People, an edition of collected shorter poems, and the republication of his first book, the children's story, The Silver Trumpet. At the end of this talk, I will share with you one of his late poems, which has still never been published. Three aspects of this career arc are salient for my purposes. First, Barfield came of age as a member of the modernist generation. T.S. Eliot was an important acquaintance, who in his role as editor and then director at Faber and Faber, was instrumental in bringing and keeping many of Barfield's books before the public. We might even say that Barfield bookended Eliot's career as a publisher. As a new employee at Faber and Guire, Eliot helped to see The Silver Trumpet into print in 1925. And one of his last major projects, the year before his death, was midwifing An Ancestral Voice through to publication. Near the end of his publishing career, Eliot told Barfield that Saving the Appearances, which Barfield also considered his most important book, made him proud to be a publisher. In the style of his writing and the shape of his career, Barfield had more in common with Eliot than he did with a typical academic. Though he spent part of his retirement as a guest professor in Canada and the United States, at no point did he consider himself professorial or a professional intellectual in that sense. The second salient point is implicit in the first and made explicit by Barfield a number of times. Everything he has to say about philosophy ultimately springs from his thought about language, and everything he thinks about language begins with his powerfully formative experience of poetic language in particular. There are plenty of Platonist poets, even in the English tradition, from Spenser onwards. However, one of Barfield's original contributions to the Platonic tradition is his thorough, systematic consideration of the nature and importance of poetic language. The third feature of his career that matters here is that Barfield saw himself, very much against the grain of his time, as defending and promoting the ideals and objectives of the Romantic poets and thinkers, especially Coleridge, Wordsworth, Percy Shelley, William Blake, Goethe, and Novalis, and idealist philosophers like Schelling, Hegel, and Rudolf Steiner, all of whom had a more than passing interest in Plato and Platonism. This is also characteristic of Barfield's independence from his modernist peers, who, with some notable exceptions, are famous for their hostility to Platonism and Romanticism alike. In later years, Barfield's interest in Romanticism brought him to the study of the Neoplatonic tradition, especially its insistence that it was not the phenomenal world that the artist imitated, but the archetypal reality behind nature. This may not have had much credibility among the philosophers of the 20th century, but Yeats did something to bring it to poets, as did Barfield's poet friend Kathleen Raine in her work on Blake and Yeats and in her role as founder of the Temenos Academy. Barfield was also convinced that the tradition needed some saving from theosophists and promoters of perennial philosophy who often misunderstood and misapplied the Platonic tradition. Barfield gently chastised them for failing to heed Plato's warning in the Philebus about rushing too quickly from the many to the one. They should be less impatient, Barfield said, to step out of imprisonment in the phenomenal world into an undifferentiated noumenal ocean. Part of Barfield's interest in the Platonic tradition involves rescuing it from those who harbor the regressive wish to retreat from the secular age by dissolving the self into the one. Having set the stage, how should we describe Barfield's philosophy? Barfield's own term for it was objective idealism, which he distinguished from subjective and Platonic idealisms. In a late interview, he defined objective idealism as the view that reality, individual being, however you think of it, consists in the polarity between the subjectivity of the individual mind and the objective world which it perceives. They are not two things, but they are one and the same thing, and what you call the objective world is merely one pole of what is a unitary process, and what we call subjective experience is the other pole, but they are not really divided from each other. I will return to this passage in more detail in a moment, but want to note in passing that this description of objective idealism is consistent with many contemporary conceptions of the Platonic position, broadly conceived. When Barfield opposes it to Platonism, he has in mind the popular view, still popular, I think, that Platonists defend a dualism that opposes the phenomenal world to the world of ideas, viewing the latter as a static and reified realm of which the familiar world is a poor and misleading copy. I don't think that is the view of those who describe themselves as indebted to or aligned with the Platonic tradition today, or that it adequately describes Barfield's own view. I am also convinced that Barfield would happily accept Lloyd Gerson's definition of a Platonist as anyone who denies nominalism, materialism, mechanism, skepticism, and relativism. Though I won't point it out each time, if you listen closely, you will find in this talk that Barfield denies each ism in turn. If I do my job well, you should also see that Barfield is an important and original voice in the history of 20th century Platonism, who is invaluable to our contemporary efforts to think through, in every sense of the word through, the secular age, efforts closely connected to alleviating the crisis of meaning. Before going on to Barfield's key concept of the evolution of consciousness, let me flesh out a bit his metaphysical position. We should do so even though the biographical order is the reverse. Barfield discovered, or believed he discovered, the existence of an evolution of consciousness, and then set about articulating a metaphysic that was adequate to account for his discovery. This is important because Barfield's arguments often take the form of a transcendental deduction. That is to say, he is often content to establish the existence of X by demonstrating its necessity from the existence of Y. In this case, his metaphysics satisfies the necessary conditions to explain the existence of an evolution of consciousness. Here I must simply state the basic features of his metaphysics as principles without arguing for or against them. As a starting place, let us consider again Barfield's late informal definition of objective idealism. Reality, individual being, however you think of it, consists in the polarity between the subjectivity of the individual mind and the objective world which it perceives. They are not two things, but they are one and the same thing, and what you call the objective world is merely one pole of what is a unitary process, and what we call subjective experience is the other pole, but they are not really divided from each other. Much in this definition hinges on the meaning of polarity, which is distinct from such similar concepts as a duality or coincidentia oppositorum by its dynamic, productive properties. Barfield describes it as both outside of time and a process in time. It is not obvious exactly what Barfield means by outside of time. Perhaps it is a universally present cosmological first principle, but he defined it, following Coleridge, as two forces of one power. This suggests not only that the two poles are generated dynamically, but that they are themselves as forces similarly energetic. The one power can be deduced from the necessity of its existence, but cannot be directly known, as it transcends discursive reason. The one power is correlative with what Barfield calls in poetic diction and other early writings, concrete thinking, which underlies and gives rise to the poetic and prosaic alike. The best we can do, but it is a good deal, is to approach the one power non-discursively via the various available aesthetic avenues of poetry, art, and music. This will become important later when Barfield takes up the threat of meaninglessness posed by modern life. Within time, polarity is a universal law at work in all dynamic living systems and between such systems when they come into contact or create progeny. It entails a hierarchy of modes of consciousness and levels of creation. It often requires us to violate the canons of classical logic in order to grasp it, as the two forces can manifest in contradictions or seeming incompatibles held together as a higher unity. This is why the apprehension of polarity is itself the basic act of imagination, and why only imagination will do in grasping it. The point is that for Barfield, any adequate concept of a living being is predicated on this universal law. He thought that was very important for medicine and the new field of ecology, to take only two examples. Even further, for reasons that will soon become clear, Barfield thought there were good grounds to consider the whole cosmos as an ensouled living being. This follows from a second facet of Barfield's metaphysics, that the universal law of polarity underlies reality itself in the form of the polarity of the subjectivity of the individual and the objective world which it perceives. He rejects the dualist theories of Descartes and Locke, the various more recent efforts to reduce consciousness to a physical substrate, and analytic efforts to declare the word consciousness meaningless. These are all symptoms, of what Charles Taylor helpfully and evocatively calls the disenchanted world populated by buffered selves. The manifold failures of all such attempts, along with the many advances in physics and the physiology of perception, make it obvious to Barfield that any even minimally successful account of consciousness requires that one admit the core phenomenological principle that thought is always about something, that consciousness is always of something. As Barfield puts it, the physicist, the neurologist, the cerebral anatomist, the psychologist, all agree that the objects we perceive and experience are at least mainly effects or constructs of a subject or community of subjects. The outness of the familiar world compels us to take polarity as a basic explanatory principle. What is outer to consciousness is indissolubly bound to it, just as consciousness, even in the form of self-consciousness, always includes outness. And this insight, that consciousness and outness are correlative and simultaneous, means that subject and object are the two fundamental aspects of an implicit anterior power, what Barfield sometimes calls the antecedent unity, from which both derive. Here we arrive at the first of Barfield's truly challenging assertions, and his first confrontation with what he called our contemporary taboos. If it is the case that consciousness and phenomena are correlative and mutually implicating opposite poles, the common sense Darwinian or neo-Darwinian assumption that a mindless universe evolved consciousness by chance after billions of years of mindless existence cannot be correct. As Barfield puts it, all the facts, if we choose to look them squarely in the face, are compelling us to regard objective existence as one correlative aspect of a perfect reciprocal relation between subject and object, the one inseparable, but not therefore indistinguishable from the other. And the same thing is true if we speak instead of mind and world. But instead of accepting this, we have been led to set up a factitious objectivity and to reify a world of objects fancied existing independently of any subject. Darwin and Lyell combined to rivet onto the Western mind that for millions of years, there were at one pole phenomena, very much like the phenomena that constitute our familiar world, but no consciousness or subjectivity at the opposite pole. If Barfield is correct, this cannot be the case, as the familiar world is familiar precisely because it correlates with consciousness. Geologists and astronomers, as soon as they imagine a pre-human past or a universe devoid of consciousness, become fabulous. Rather, evolution is of phenomena, which are irreducibly both subjective and objective, inner and outer, mind and world. Or as Barfield sometimes puts it in a provocative aphorism, nature is humanity's unconscious. If Barfield is right to describe himself as an objective idealist, and if it is fair to see objective idealism as a species of Platonism, then the first of Barfield's major philosophical innovations that needs to be thought through is his proposal of a new field of study, the evolution of consciousness. Barfield used the phrase evolution of consciousness for the first time in 1926. As far as I know, that is the first use of the phrase in the English language. Barfield would later distinguish it from the ordinary study of history, as well as from the history of ideas, which was founded as a field of study by A.O. Lovejoy 10 years after Barfield coined the phrase evolution of consciousness. Barfield described the evolution of consciousness as focused on the history or evolution of perception itself, whereas the history of ideas is concerned with the history of changing ideas about unchanging percepts. Historians of ideas sometimes imagine a kind of eternal present, in which one might invite Aristotle and Kant to the same table to compare their different definitions and understandings of the imagination, though the historically prior figure is always at a dialectical disadvantage. As Barfield puts it in Saving the Appearances, a history of thought, as such, amounts to a dialectical or syllogistic process, the thoughts of one age arising discursively out of, challenging, and modifying the thoughts and discoveries of the previous one. Study of the evolution of consciousness, by contrast, contends that in addition to the dialectical history of ideas, there are forces at work beneath the threshold in the evolution even of modern consciousness. Even modern consciousness. Because while modern people pride themselves on conscious mastery of the most important truths and values, that is as illusory as the ontological independence of nature from consciousness. Perhaps one way to approach the distinction is that the history of ideas is concerned with particular meanings. What do Kant and Aristotle mean by imagination, but not necessarily with the problem of meaning as such. For the study of the evolution of consciousness, however, the problem of meaning is central to any inquiry because the fundamental coherence of experience, the changing shape of consciousness itself, is always at issue. It is also worth noting that for Barfield, an inability to grasp the importance or even the existence of the distinction between the evolution of consciousness and the history of ideas makes one vulnerable to the danger of smuggling into one's worldview what he calls a residue of unresolved positivism, or RUP. Barfield sometimes noted ruefully that even his anti-positivist contemporaries often retained RUP in their most important ideas. He thought this was true of Whitehead's process philosophy, Jung's collective unconscious, Collingwood's idealist historiography, and Cassir's philosophy of symbolic forms, to name a few. A properly Barfieldian approach to contemporary forms and applications of Platonism/objective idealism should also be alert to the fungal creep of positivist mildew into the walls of its system. Near the end of this talk, I will suggest that perhaps Charles Taylor's notion of re-enchantment is mildly infected in this way. I have thus far said more about what the evolution of consciousness is not than what it is. Nor does that seem an easy thing to do. After all, by what method can one follow up the hypothesis that perception itself has a history? Here we arrive at the second of Barfield's striking insights. For Barfield, the history of language is the royal road to the evolution of consciousness. It is the sine qua non of language that when we use a word, we reenact or adopt or reanimate or entertain the thought of previous users of the same word, or some part at least of that thought. It may be a very small part indeed, but we must be doing just that thing to some extent, for otherwise we should not be uttering a word at all, but simply making a noise. Whatever else it may be, a word differs from a noise or a scribble because it is, in Barfield's formulation, the primary vehicle we possess for the understanding and expression of meaning. Barfield often quoted Emerson's epigraph that all language is fossil poetry, because for him, language serves as a kind of fossil record for the history of consciousness. There is a difference, he wrote in his mid-20s, between the record of rocks and the secrets which are hidden in language. Whereas the former can only give us knowledge of outward dead things, such as forgotten seas and the bodily shapes of prehistoric animals and primitive man, language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. This puts it more starkly than Barfield would in later years. He will come to see that the world of outer phenomena also consists of signs and symbols. In fact, this would also be the basis for his main criticism of Collingwood's idealist philosophy of history. Collingwood bases his doctrine on the presupposition, which he takes for granted, that man has what he calls an inside, but nature has no inside. Thought, of which he says history consists, is the inside of man and his actions, but nature has no corresponding inside, no inside at all. We see that in conceiving thought as the product of man's physical organism, although this is quite incompatible with that view of the super-individual essence of thought, which he himself has just categorically stated. This is the considered view of the mature Barfields. But the crucial point of his earliest statement is simple, even if the implications are large. If language is the vehicle and record of consciousness, then the history of language is a record of the history of consciousness. When Barfield came to add that mind and world stand in polar and necessary relation to each other, and that the essence of thought is super-individual, he could go still further and say that the history of consciousness is the history of phenomena. As he put it elsewhere, the method which a history of consciousness, as distinct from a history of ideas, must adopt is to penetrate into the very texture and activity of thought, rather than to collate conclusions. It is concerned semantically with the way in which words are used, rather than with the product of discourse. Expressed in terms of logic, its business is more with the proposition than with the syllogism, and more with the term than with the proposition. Therefore, it must particularize. What then does the history of language reveal about the evolution of consciousness? Here is one of Barfield's many statements on the matter. If you are, or if you become convinced that what we perceive is inseparable from how we think, which is the same as saying that the world around us is inseparable from the way we think, though it is certainly not indistinguishable from it, then a lot of things follow. One of them is the privilege of discovering how very differently mankind used to think in the remote past. By that, I do not mean simply that they did not, for the most part, think analytically, logically, causally. Many anthropologists and others have discovered that, without, however, making the discovery I am referring to. I mean that the thoughts themselves were images rather than concepts. And this entails that the world they lived in was different from the world we live in today. It would be as true, perhaps truer, to say that they perceived images as to say that they thought them. What we perceive as things, they perceived as images, and it is this discovery which enables us to grasp the distinction between the history of ideas and the history of consciousness. It should become clear in a moment what Barfield intends by distinguishing a thing from an image in this way. We might say as a beginning that a thing is a calcified or reified image, or that an image is midway between a thing and an idea, and has the characteristics that Coleridge attributed to the symbol, that it exhibits the translucence of the eternal through and in the temporal. Barfield gets to this metaphysical distinction by way of an examination of the history of language. One very well-known aspect of it is that throughout the recorded history of language, the movement of meaning has been from concrete to abstract. To take one example that speaks with particular force to teenagers, the word sarcasm traces back to the Greek sarkazein, meaning to strip off flesh. One of Barfield's favorite examples is that pneuma means both wind and spirit. A few minutes with an etymological dictionary are enough to show that virtually every word of sufficient age that is abstract today has an originally concrete meaning. The other fact that emerges immediately, and that is also often noted, is that language becomes increasingly figurative the further back one goes. Hence Emerson's aphorism that all language is fossil poetry. Both of these facts were well known in the decades preceding Barfield's maturity, but philologists struggle to reconcile them with the emergent dominance of Darwinian evolution. How to account for the increasingly concrete and figurative nature of language the further back one goes in its history? The dominant explanation, at least as far as Barfield was concerned, was Max Muller's imitative bow-wow theory. Barfield had great respect for Muller as a thinker and scholar. However, even Muller perpetrated what Barfield called the sin of literalism. Muller recognized very well the two facts just mentioned, but in order to account for the origin of language, consistent with the assumption of human consciousness evolving out of animal consciousness, it was forced to posit an initial descriptive phase that was followed by the rise of a group of mighty poets who began to greatly enrich language with heaps and heaps of metaphors. This is a fine example of what Charles Taylor calls the descriptive or Lockean theory of language. Barfield instead offers a paradigmatic constitutive or Baconian theory. He argues that Muller is misled by his Darwinist literalist assumptions to ignore the evidence he has gathered. What the evidence points to is not an initial prehistorical descriptive phase that somehow erupts into universally figurative language. If instead we approach the history of meaning free from all assumptions based on biological theories of evolution, and take our stand simply on a faithful study of the nature of language, we see in the nearly universal figurative nature of archaic language not a literalist imitative origin followed by a metaphorical stage, but a participatory origin with gradually increasing literalism. A proper understanding of the history of language helps to cut against materialist accounts of the origin and evolution of human consciousness. The conventional account is of the development of animal consciousness into human consciousness as an adaptive response to a hostile environment. It proceeds from blank incomprehension into greater and greater understanding of the world's workings, with the result that we can manipulate it and its resources to our advantage. Barfield instead affirms categorically that for the 19th century fantasy of early man first gazing with his mind tabula rasa at natural phenomena like ours, then seeking to explain them with thoughts like ours, and then by a process of inference peopling them with the airy phantoms of mythology, there is just not any single shred of evidence whatsoever. Rather, for archaic and indigenous cultures, the cosmos is a vast, meaning-saturated theophany into which humanity is fully and harmoniously integrated. All the evidence from etymology and elsewhere, Barfield says, goes to show that the further back we penetrate into the past of human consciousness, the more mythical in their nature do the representations become. Barfield calls this indigenous or archaic age original participation. It is the furthest we can go towards prehistory. We in the modern West have come to accept that the world we perceive as an array of representations with a more fundamental, unrepresented reality beneath it. If we are sufficiently postmodern, we may even refer to our represented world as a massive simulacrum for which there is no original. Here is how Barfield explains the distinction between original participation and our modern, relatively non-participated consciousness. For us, the represented is conceived as within our percipient selves, and it is only the unrepresented physical base which we conceive of as without. Not so for primitives. For them, the unrepresented, too, is conceived as without, as outside, so that there is no question of conscious figuration. It may sometimes be detected within, but it is detected primarily without. The human soul may be one of the stopping places for mana, But what differentiates the primitive mind from ours is that it conceives itself to be only one of those stopping places, and not necessarily the most significant. The essence of original participation is that there stands behind the phenomena, and on the other side of them from me, a represented which is of the same nature as me, whether it is called mana, or by the names of many gods and demons, or God the Father, or the spirit world, it is of the same nature as the perceiving self, inasmuch as it is not mechanical or accidental, but psychic and voluntary. This is an essentially theophanic experience of the world as teeming with gods and meanings. It is so immersive that there is relatively little of a developed sense of individual selfhood. Barfield noted regarding the famous Sanskrit phrase tattvam asi, I am that, from the Chandogya Upanishad, that the difficulty was not of experiencing the identity, but getting enough distance to become self-conscious of it. The wondering emphasis in I am that for original participation is on I am that, whereas for us, the emphasis is now on that. I am that. Even as late as the Middle Ages, in what used to be called Christendom, people experienced the universe as a kind of theophany, in which they participated at different levels, in being, in thinking, in speaking or naming, and in knowing. The course of the evolution of consciousness and of phenomena has, on the whole, been the shrinking of the theophanic universe into mostly empty space through which physical objects move with meaningless mechanical predictability. This loss is compensated by our sense of freedom. The chains of destiny, manipulation by spiritual powers, inescapable astrological influences have all melted so that we experience ourselves as self-determined and self-aware, positing for ourselves our own values based on our own hard-won understanding of what it is to be a human being. This has been accomplished by the development of clear, rigorous thought and self-conscious empirical methods of inquiry. We also have a greater ability to manipulate and exploit the world around us. Barfield characterizes this as dashboard knowledge, conceiving the cosmos as a machine, and then pushing buttons and moving levers to see what makes the car move. We tend to mistake that for true knowledge, or to think the cosmic machine consists solely of dashboard features, but it is also an indication of our alienation from, or in Heideggerian language, forgetfulness of, the meaning of being. The cosmos, from our vantage of relative non-participation, is surface all the way down. For us, nature has no inwards, nor is there any question of a return to original participation. That world is, as Barfield puts it, forever gone. All efforts to follow the umbilical cord back from the many to the one are doomed to failure or madness. Hence our crisis of meaning, our pervasive sense of disconnection and anxiety. We have arrived at Barfield's account of how the world became disenchanted for us, i.e., at the crisis of meaning. Contemporary discussion of this topic has been sparked anew in recent years by Charles Taylor's account of disenchantment and reenchantment. For Taylor, as for Barfield, the enchanted world is one filled with spirits and moral forces, and one, moreover, in which these forces impinged on human beings. That is, the boundary between the self and these forces was somewhat porous. And in the enchanted world, meanings are not only in the mind, but can reside in various kinds of extra-human but intracosmic subjects. It is a world marked by strangeness, in which the line between personal agency and impersonal force was not at all clearly drawn. For Taylor, as for Barfield, there is no way back. We cannot return to the oceanic one if the self drowns in the process. Even so, Taylor's tone differs from Barfield's in ways that may point to a larger divergence of views. The whole import of Barfield's metaphysics of the dynamic, polar interpenetration of mind and world, anchored in an antecedent unity, is that in following the evolution of consciousness back upstream to our archaic origins, we overcome both our doubts about the ontological legitimacy of the enchanted world and the secret, perhaps unconscious, conviction that 19th century positivists were right after all about the primacy of mind over matter. Taylor, on the other hand, is less committal. Some commentators have wondered aloud if he is a closeted Platonist, but he is explicit that in his judgment, Platonism just doesn't work. Moreover, though he refers to the enchanted world in the simple past tense, it is unclear whether he is simply describing the mental states and cultural practices of its inhabitants, a la anthropology, or like Barfield, he would affirm its ontological integrity. It is unclear, in other words, whether Taylor's enchanted world belongs to the history of ideas or to the evolution of consciousness. Taylor's caution affects his prescriptions for re-enchantment. He advocates that we foster tentative feelings of wonder and awe at the depth and greatness of the universe, and that we cultivate love for it on that basis. He recognizes that there remains a question whether purely anthropomorphic articulations can do justice to our sense of wonder and other related evaluations, but is content to acknowledge that it will remain a bone of contention. Taylor ties his self-limiting prescription to the complex philosophical anthropology that he began to develop in earnest in Sources of the Self. But from a Barfieldian point of view, it is too anemic to adequately meet the scale of the crisis of meaning. For example, it probably does not do to think of the sense of wonder as anything so reasonable as an evaluation. Even the notion of purely anthropomorphic re-enchantment misses that participation must be at its root, and so suggests the faint odor of residual positivism. The reasonable evaluation that wisdom enhances the meaningful life is not enough to liquefy the fatty buffers around the self. The prudent judgment that it is best to be loving is not the same as to love. But if not Taylor's prudent prescription, what does Barfield propose? First, we should note that though Barfield's diagnosis of the buffered self is more vividly described than Taylor's, it is similar in its essentials. Writing in 1928, the same year that saw the publication of Sein und Zeit, Barfield describes the modern self as tormented by the experience that it is that which is cut off, what is left, the paradoxical 0 point where self-consciousness and non-entity coincide. Barfield also sees that the vaunted progress of knowledge, which has been going on since the 17th century, has been progress in alienation. And in 1961, he noted that amid all the menacing signs that surround us in the middle of the 20th century, perhaps the one that fills most people, thoughtful people, with the greatest foreboding is the gradual general sense of meaninglessness. It is this which underlies most of the other threats. For Barfield, a properly scaled response to this all-pervading sense of meaninglessness is total self-transformation. The self must reclaim and regain porousness. It must, he says, turn inside out. Half measures will not do. He presents this as an alternative to the ordinary experience of human beings today. Here is the dilemma. Ordinary conscious experience always has two sides to it, an inner and an outer. No matter what it may be of which I am conscious, whether it is of houses and trees, or whether it is only of memories, or whether it is of light itself, there is always the duality, the subjective-objective duality, which is signified by the word of. There is on the outer side that of which I am conscious, and on the inner side that in me which is conscious. I can never at any moment be conscious of that innermost me, which is actually doing the business of being conscious. To overcome this infinitely regressive buffering is to get past the inveterate pre-conscious assumption of our alienation and to discover that consciousness is not a tiny bit of the world stuck onto the rest of it. It is the inside of the whole world. The solution to the crisis of meaning is to achieve the felt experience, not merely the intellectual conviction that consciousness is the world, not merely of it. This, however, seems to entail precisely the headlong rush to the one that Barfield warned of. How to maintain the integrity of the self while asserting its identity with the world. Once again, Barfield's answer lies in a consideration of language, focused in his case on its essentially figurative nature. To reclaim the porous self is to rediscover meaning, just as to rediscover meaning is to reclaim porousness. Now, the first step on the road to rediscovered meaning is to overcome what, in Saving the Appearances, he calls the dead center of literalness, because the experience of the literal is the experience of inert, independent entities, whether these are fixtures of our inner world, abstract nouns, for example, or supposedly freestanding objects in the outer world. The literal, in other words, is an essential feature of the buffered self. It is also an illusion. As Barfield demonstrates in his brilliant essay, The Meaning of Literal, if we explore the notion, perhaps we can call it a dogma, of the literal with enough patience, we discover a number of things. First, we find that there is indeed no such thing as literalness. The most we can safely say is that the literal and discursive use of language is the way in which it is used by a speaker who is either unaware of or deliberately ignoring that real and figurative relation between man and his environment, out of which the words he is using were born, and without which they could never have been born. The discovery that the literal is illusory is something more fundamental than to become convinced, say, that descriptive theories of language are mistaken. If each of us looks around our offices right now, we will probably see an assemblage of literal objects, and are probably, as Barfield puts it, unaware that the experience of literalness is an evolutionary latecomer. To turn inside out is to replace our habitual experience of literalness with the habitual experience of the figural. Words are things that exceed themselves as things. So too are things more than themselves, and in abandoning the specter of born literalness, we shall also abandon the whole dream of fixed entities with which literal meanings must somehow correspond. Correlative with this, though, are the related positive claims that discovery, consciousness, and symbolization go hand in hand, and that consciousness and symbolization are simultaneous and correlative. To abandon the positivist myth of the literal is not to step into the void or the free play of signifiers, nor is it to leap into the one at the cost of the self. If the fundamental polar expression of the antecedent unity is mind and world, its fundamental logical expression is that A equals B. To dissolve the self in the one is to assert, perhaps despite oneself, that A equals A, and so to arrive at the literal dead center once again. To pursue Barfield's figurative logic is to assert the metaphorical identity of self and world, which entails both their underlying unity and their fundamental irreducibility. Hence the emphasis Barfield often places on distinguishing where one cannot divide. It is also to recognize that the natural world can only be understood in depth as a series of images symbolizing concepts, that it is out of man's awareness of this meaningful relation between himself and nature that language originally came to birth. And it is to acknowledge that this symbolic significance is inherent in the forms of the outer world themselves. The figurative, in other words, does not accrete on the literal, but is itself at the fundament of meaning. For the literalist, the cosmos is surface all the way down. For the figuralist, if I may coin the term, it is depth all the way up. This, of course, is the theophanic, wonder-drenched world of original participation in a new form, if we can only bring it from a relatively disembodied, merely intellectual conviction into our lived experience. On the far side of the age of literalism, it must be reacquired purposefully through the systematic cultivation of the symbolizing imagination. Barfield suggests a number of meditative tools for working in that direction. Final participation, which Barfield describes not as an eschatological end, but as a direction in which we had all better be moving, is the self-aware, balanced recovery of the pre-conscious, figurative common sense of original participation, a reunion with the one that does not entail the dissolution of the self. One simple practice advocated by Barfield as a step in the direction of final participation is careful attention to poetry. Among Barfield's favorite examples is one from Percy Shelley at his most Platonic. My soul is an enchanted boat. Barfield usually stops here, but I can't resist giving the next few lines. My soul is an enchanted boat, which like a sleeping swan doth float upon the silver waves of thy sweet singing, and thine doth like an angel sit beside the helm conducting it, whilst all the winds with melody are ringing. If you are like me, you'll be moved by this statement of Platonic love. More importantly, you will find that the meaning of the word soul has slightly expanded for you by describing it as an enchanted boat. And in addition, that boats mean something different to you going forward. This is a good example of the way that metaphor expands meaning. Discursive attempts to define the soul have the effect that it is continually being dried up, as it were, and left for dead in the human mind by the operation of a purely discursive intellectual activity, of which language is a necessary tool. Metaphor is the primary means to introduce new meanings into language, and so to directly intervene in the crisis of meaning, as this is narrowly construed in its direct relation to language. For most of us, these are continually shriveling into literal husks. For Barfield, to overcome the crisis of meaning is to gradually break the spell of the literal as such, to habitually experience the omnipresence of the figurative, and so to have the porous experience of both the self and the world as permeated by meaning across all of its dynamic hierarchies. Barfield did not think the word meaning could be precisely defined, but did not consider it meaningless for that reason either. In his essay, The Nature of Meaning, he takes an analytical approach and starts from the end of the meaningless. Thus, a figurative statement like, the dawn has rosy fingers, has an impossible to define something that is lacking in a simply inaccurate statement like, the dawn paid its income tax on time this year. The something that the trope has is missing from the mistake. The something could perhaps be best described as the frisson that accompanies feeling in some slight way the revelation of the one power in the momentary reuniting of the two poles. More broadly, though, metaphor and other such tropes and figures also engage the faculty of the imagination, and so help to build the faculty that is necessary to address the meaning crisis in the broader sense of living a meaningful life. Barfield agreed with Wittgenstein that logical claims reduce to tautology and that ordinary predication falls under the rules of logic, hence the continual drying up of meaning. A metaphor or synecdoche is not a judgment or claim, however, but a mode of relation to the world. In this sense, the poet is akin to the primary artist in Thoreau's Walden. A sculptor shapes stone, but the primary artist shapes the faculties of perception themselves. Metaphor, in flouting the rules of logic by asserting the identity of A and B, stakes out a fundamentally different mode of relation to the world. To hold a metaphor or synecdoche in mind as a mode of relation to the world is to unbuffer the self. It begins to become porous. This is why Barfield was powerfully impressed by Vladimir Solovyov's little book, The Meaning of Love. Solovyov's goal was to overcome the alienated twofold impenetrability of bodies and phenomena by means of the inward all-one idea. Solovyov offers a definition of fully transformative love in which each partner is the whole, not by merger, but on the contrary, by an intensive development of its true individuality or partness. This is the synecdochical logic of microcosm and macrocosm, but experienced through deep romantic love that might also be, say, the love for the earth. This includes a bit more, I think, than Charles Taylor's prudent claims for the virtues of love. Barfield approaches the meaning crisis by demanding that the self fundamentally redefine and reground itself in a way that fully shifts our notions, and more important, our experiences of belonging, purpose, connectedness from discursive to figurative ground. Barfield sought to facilitate this transformation in many of his creative works. Let me close this talk with one of the spare minimalist poems of his late period. It is titled The Meaning of Love. see if you notice in the three simple stanzas a development from romantic love through Platonic love to the eschatological embrace of figuration at the end. Fragrance of latency, joy unexpressed, beautiful silences, breast to breast. Gold of her loveliness, shining through flesh, light of the universe, bodied afresh. Call from futurity, many in one, glimpse of that mystery, earth to be sun.
Thank you very much for this introduction into Owen Barfield's thought, and also for connecting this thought to a broader tradition, Platonic tradition, and both philosophical and literary. So now we have time for discussion, questions, or comments, remarks. So you can raise your virtual hand or your real hand if you want to ask a question. Okay, our student Ilya, the first question.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. The only thing that something that I read from Barfield was just parts of the poetic diction, some parts that Professor Stroszynski chose for us to read. And I was quite surprised that nobody really, I never heard this name, and really it is not very well known. I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the reasons for this? And the second, if you met Barfield during his life, and what kind of a person was he, if you can tell something about.
Oh, wow. Okay. What a great quote. That's so nice. It allows me to go down memory lane. Let me see. So I think, let me begin with the second part of your question. So I did meet him during his lifetime multiple times. He was a friend of my family, so of my mother in particular. So I met him for the first time when I was 9 years old, and played a game of chess with him. We went on a vacation together, things like that. And then when I was about 21 or so, I met him a couple of other times. And when I was about 21 or so, a senior in college, I was going through an existential crisis of my own, probably many of them. Uh, and and he and I had a correspondence together. And he was at that time very elderly. And even so, he answered all of my letters. He took all of my, what I look back now, it's kind of embarrassing, the kinds of things I was asking him, but he took them all very seriously. No hint that he was judging me in any way, and just with full respect for where I was at the moment. And I know he had that kind of correspondence with many people. He had incredibly selfless with his attention. In his later years, he became pretty well known, and there were many people who would just show up out of the woodwork. They would often just show up at his retirement home he was living in and say, "Here I am, entertain me." And he was always very, very gracious with people. So if you see pictures of him, he is almost always wearing like a tweed suit with a carefully knotted tie, smoking a pipe maybe, very much a proper gentleman. So he has these ideas that for many people are very wild. And I think it's an important, brings an important balance into his presence in the world, that he maintained himself with this kind of formality and this kind of propriety, this properness, this respect in a certain way for traditions and norms, while he's busy exploding them all over the place, right? So there's something in that I find, is probably the wrong word, but it's the one that comes to mind, something very healthy about that, I think. So anyway, so yeah, so those are some of my memories of him. Um, he was not a good speaker. He had a stutter. So, and he mumbled. So if you see interviews with him, it's very hard to make out what he's what he's saying. He tends to kind of talk into his chest. So there's a kind of shyness in him, uh, and yet a gracefulness and ease in his thought as well. He moves across different domains of thought, different ways of thinking, very fluidly. And he thought about becoming a professional dancer, and his wife was a professional dancer, right? So he has that, I think, in his way of being. And if you see in any of these video clips of him very old in his 90s, you can even see in the way he steps, like, oh, there's the dancer in the way that he steps. So it might be a good thing if you're reading him. This might be a fun project. See where you can find in the rhythm of his thinking, find the dancer, because I think it's there. Yeah. So anyway, so that's a bit about him as a person. Yeah. So why didn't he catch on? Um, I think that's a complex question. There are at least two sides of it. Like he has his own role in that, right? So he's not just a victim. So on the one hand, he his commitment to this tradition I've tried to describe in this talk, and his commitment to the Romantic movement was out of step with his time. So that's that. So, in this era of like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and in philosophy in the English language world, Bertrand Russell was like the great lion in British culture. And there's nobody more opposed to what Barfield was bringing than someone like Bertrand Russell. Cambridge at that time had a very analytical school of philosophy, probably still does, I don't know. Mateusz could probably say, but very hostile to what Barfield was bringing. It didn't help that he wasn't a good speaker. He wasn't a good lecturer. And so he almost got hired at Oxford, and he gave a talk at Oxford, and they said, yeah, maybe not. And I don't think he would have been that great of a teacher. Um, so, and he said in his later years that his inner obstacle, the part of his character, his personality that he had to struggle with was his ego, his arrogance, that he had a tendency to that. And I think that's a good self-assessment on his part. And it got in his way sometimes. So I tell this probably too often, but I find it meaningful that T.S. Eliot wanted to be friends with him, wanted to help him in his career. It did help him quite a bit, but wanted to help him more. Um, and said things like, come meet me for tea. Like he invited him multiple times to come meet with him, and he wanted to invite him into this inner circle of poets and thinkers, and to help him along, write introductions to his works and promote them in his talks and so on. And Barfield didn't take him up on those offers. Barfield submitted his poem The Tower to Eliot when he was editing the Criterion. And Eliot said, I can't publish it, it's too long. And Yeats is about to publish a poem with the same title. So that's not going to work from a marketing point of view. But look at my friend Virginia Woolf, and she'll publish it with the Hogarth Press. But Barfield didn't think too highly of Virginia Woolf, so he didn't take him up on that. Right. So, so a little bit of just shooting himself in the foot, as we say in the United States, getting in his own way. And I think that's his pride talking there, probably. So, and also he's ahead of his time, I think, as well. And I think remains ahead of his time, actually. He said that apparently he gave different numbers, but the number I heard him give was that he said that he would not be understood until 70 years after his death, right? And then people would be ready. It's a kind of Nietzschean sort of claim to make. He's writing for posterity or something, but he has a better phrase than that. I don't know if you remember what it is. I have a posthumous audience or something like that. But yeah, in any case, so I think there's something in that as well. I think people often have the experience that he's such a clear thinker that if you're reading, and he gets more clear beyond poetic diction, by the way. So if you read other Saving the Appearances, for example, at the essays in Rediscovery of Meaning. Very clear, meticulous. And you follow him all the way through and you arrive at the end and you feel convinced by what he says. But then if you have to describe for yourself the argument he just made, it's very difficult, even though you just read it. Like, wait, what did I just get convinced of? And I think that's because he challenges our common sense to such an extent that we have to rebuild our common sense in order to actually absorb what he's saying. That's a long answer. That's probably too much, but hopefully that's good enough.
Thank you. And I think it's interesting that Lewis and Tolkien, who were his friends, they became famous for their fiction, for their fantasy fiction, not for their poetry, like verse, and not even well. Lewis was partly recognized for his apologetics, philosophy, but really what made him famous was like Screwtape Letters, for instance, in America.
Yeah.
So it was a work of fiction, or The Great Divorce, or Narnia stories, and Tolkien. Well, Tolkien, no one expected really Tolkien to become famous, right? It was a kind of an accident in 1960s that American students became interested in the pirate version of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, Tolkien, it's very difficult for us to even imagine that. But Tolkien was, well, he could have become this Oxford Dawn read by people interested in Lewis as well, like Barfield. So I think history is full of accidents and mysterious turns of events. And something happened that Lewis was, worshipping Barfield and quoting him in his various works. And Tolkien was also profoundly influenced by him, but it didn't help as much as it could. And it's very interesting to me as well why this. But I think Barfield didn't have that talent for prose, for poetry, or imaginative writing. Although he's a very original poet and writer, I think. But when I compare him to his friends, even to Charles Williams, maybe that's my personal taste. But sometimes he feels difficult. He feels difficult, and his stories are not stories that will just take you in. And there is this sophistication and depth to them. He's a very challenging author. I don't know if you. Well,
I agree.
You wrote a whole book on his poetry. So.
Well, I agree about part of what you said. Yeah, I think that as a storyteller, that he's never going to be that popular. He doesn't drive along action. He writes in a literary critics sometimes talk about what's called the novel of ideas. And I think Barfield kind of fits in the novel of ideas category. He's very good at having people sit down and talk to each other and not so good at driving along action. Right. So people like Lewis and Tolkien, they're dynamic prose writers and they are great storytellers. Well, Tolkien in particular. I'm not a huge Lewis fan with the storytelling either, but he's got a much better style, I think, than Barfield does with storytelling. Much more, well, better is not the right word, but more popular, more easily communicable, easier to enter into than Barfield is. As a poet, I think that I like Barfield's poetry more than Lewis or Tolkien. Purely in the poetry. And I think Lewis has a stiffness and immaturity that never goes away. I feel like I'm reading the 18-year-old poet forever with him, and he doesn't outgrow it for me. Barfield has much more interest in poetic experimentation, writes all kinds of things, and has a range of style, actually, and genre that Lewis and Tolkien never approach. Charles Williams, so Barfield didn't like Williams's poetry, and I think that's a great shame. I think Williams is a great poet, and very dense, but kind of it's like looking at sculptures almost, like modernist craggy sculptures. Very interesting to me, and so for me, just among the Inklings, if we're, I'm not so into the business of ranking, but if we're just thinking of who endures and who doesn't as poets, for me, it's Charles Williams, whose Arthurian poetry is really fascinating and strange. And Barfield actually is an undiscovered poet, really. And we'll have to see, where he fits in, but into the tradition. And then Lewis and Tolkien for their poetry, I think they'll probably be forgotten in the end. It'll be less interest.
All right. Okay, are there any other questions or comments about anything really related to a very broad
Yeah,
topic?
if I can, I would like to ask a question. Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really engaging, and I got to know a lot of things that I didn't know. So, thank you very much. As a Tolkien enthusiast, I knew something about Barfield, but it was really superficial knowledge. So, thank you. But I wanted to ask how much Barfield was in depth to anthroposophy as a system of thought, since I know that he was quite acquainted with Steiner, and so I want to know how much of anthroposophy concepts he made his own in his thinking, and how much he built on them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. So Barfield is deeply indebted to anthroposophy, and was a member of the Anthroposophical Society. Was one of the earliest members from England. I forget where in order he is in the signing up for membership, but he's for sure in the top 10. It might be the third one or something, I forget. Anyway, so he was very early in the 1920s, became interested in Steiner, in anthroposophy, met him one time, even when Steiner was lecturing in England, and passed up the chance to have an interview with him. So Steiner kind of picked him out of the crowd and said, if you would like to have an interview with me, I'd be happy to talk to you. And apparently Barfield's account was that he thought Steiner was too tired and he had too many other people asking him for interviews and he didn't want to be impolite, right? So he said declined for that reason. And I'm not sure if he regretted it later or not. It caused some tension in his marriage because his wife was hostile to anthroposophy, was not interested in it, and would rather he hadn't taken it up. And so she felt a little bit ambushed that this person she just married suddenly becomes interested in anthroposophy right after they get married. And it's like, who are you? So that created some issues, I think, in their marriage. But he remained a member for the rest of his life and was very active. My impression, so some people who get involved in anthroposophy just take it as a body of doctrines and they try to absorb it and they just spend their lives trying to figure out what it's about. And Barfield's not like that. I think he's much more creative. He's always an artist from my point of view in what he's doing. That's the dancer of thought. I think he does that with anthroposophy as well. So it's a dance partner or material for his poetic sensibility. And he shapes it into a cosmology, right? So for Barfield, in the end, philosophy only takes you so far. And then it's, well, what do you do with it? And part of what you do with it, part of this path of self-transformation that he advocates is creating a cosmology. And there are many different ways that can be done. And his way of doing it is to take anthroposophy, which he himself considered a vast poem, and to reshape it for oneself so that it becomes a kind of artistic, you might say, cosmology or worldview, so that you're inhabiting now a worldview that is itself a work of art, right? And using that to change oneself. So that's a little bit like the quote from Thoreau that I used, that the primary artist, that's my term, not Thoreau's, but the primary artist, unlike the ordinary artist, reshapes the faculties of perception themselves, right? So the way in which one way in which that's done for Barfield is by cultivating, crafting a cosmology that is a work of art and then inhabiting that world. So, and I should say also, he was very closely connected to Tolkien, although they weren't great friends. He had a huge influence on Tolkien. And Barfield himself said that of all the Inklings, he was the closest to Tolkien in his sense of the world and the nature and practice of poetry and fiction, art, and so on. That he and Tolkien were closely allied, and Tolkien felt the same, although they didn't have the same kind of deep friendship that he did with C.S. Lewis.
Thank you very much. Thank
you. Connected to that a bit, I wanted to ask you about the two strands that I see in Barfield, namely language and image. You mentioned the importance of image, especially in saving the appearances. And of course, poetic diction is all about language and metaphors, because basically what you describe as original participation, or the sense of the world as having the inside suffused with life and consciousness. This was famously and beautifully formulated by the medieval philosopher and poet Alanus ab Insulis, or Alain de Lille, Alan of Lille. In his short, part of the poem is omnis mundi creatura quasi liber et pictura nobis est in speculum, which means every creature of this world is like a book and like an image presented to us in a mirror. So, of course, that's a very good description of what Barfield was into. So to see the world as this mirror of God, and to see everything as being a symbol, an icon. But in this poem, it's interesting that Alanus, he says it's quasi liber et pictura. So it's both a book, which means language, words, and something pictorial. Perhaps, in the Middle Ages, perhaps he thought that the educated are able to access books and language and concepts, while the uneducated can access the visual arts, cathedrals and stained glass or whatever. But I'm wondering about the Barfield himself. How he, is he more focused for you on language, on that aspect of this symbolism, or he's also interested in images in the sense of the tradition of icons, that is images that are transparent, that are not about themselves but are opened up towards this theophanic event, because I think it's I don't have a clear answer. I don't know Barfield that well, so I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, it's both. Yeah, absolutely both. He was very interested in the school of Chartres and knew Bernardus Silvestris and Alain de Lille and so on, and draws on them, or gets inspiration from them, better to put it that way. He says in Saving the Appearances that so he at different points in that book, he says, I wrote it for this reason, and he gives different reasons. So one of them is that I wrote it so that people would get more interested in anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner. And then because he thinks that would be good for us to explore more. But then he also says that the purpose for the book was for people to see and to take up that we need to recover aspects of the medieval experience of the world in the modern world, that there's something that we've lost from that experience that we need to recover. And it's precisely this sense, this whole tradition of the book of nature and taking it seriously, and not just as a dead image, this kind of Augustinian idea, that there's the book of scripture and the book of nature, and he takes that quite seriously poetically. He in a couple of when he starts reading in the middle of the 20th century, Gombrich and Edgar Wind start writing this amazing Panofsky, producing this amazing art criticism that's philosophically informed and makes essentially the same point about the participated nature of the image. Barfield is very interested in those writers, and in a couple of essays, well, one in I always forget which one it is. Maybe it's in both. The rediscovery, or sorry, then oh gosh, what is it called? There are two essays in the rediscovery of meaning about allegory, and they're called something something allegory 1 and something something allegory 2. And if you just look at the table of contents,
the meaning of allegory, I think
it might be. I'm suddenly
it's a
okay.
review
I'm questioning
Gombrich.
myself. Yes, exactly. And so that's one place where he shows that. It also comes back in Eager Spring, this novella that he wrote at the very end of his life, where his main character is very interested in medieval art and medieval allegory, which is not just a literary phenomenon, right? But again, as a way of experiencing the world. And so she takes that up as her path of study, and it's the right path for her to be on, right? So I would say that Barfield wouldn't draw a hard line between language and the image, or between the book of the poem, let's say, and the book of nature. For him, they're again mutually implicating and porous to each other.
And I think when you quoted Shelley's, I think it's from Prometheus Bound, right?
Yeah, on Prometheus Unbound, yeah.
Well, on the one hand, Barfield says that the word is the symbol of consciousness, but in this particular quotation, a beautiful poem by Shelley, it's at least for me, it's very hard not to imagine what he is writing about. The silver, the silver music, or the silver song. I mean, it's very synesthetic, so it's very difficult to imagine. How can you imagine a boat floating on a silvery tune?
Absolutely.
Or whatever? Yeah, but there is this sense that it's not just words. These words are tied to images.
And it's not an accidental allusion on Barfield's part. Like, that's another, if you're taking up some study of Barfield, I think it's worthwhile to pay attention to when he makes allusions to other works and the larger context of those works, because he always has something more in mind than just the juicy quote, right? There's something in the background, a deeper thoughtfulness about it. And in this case, he likes to quote these lines from Shelley's poem, and Prometheus Unbound is allegorical in the romantic sense. So Prometheus is an image of the imagination, and Asia, who's doing the song that he's floating on, is an image of nature, right? So here's what's being described in that poem is the reuniting of might say subjectivity and objectivity, or imagination and nature, right? However you want to put it. But it's a good example of what you're describing, Mateusz, right? That it's, okay, so you read it in a poem, but now the point is to go out and experience it in nature, right? Cultivate it within oneself and have it become a part of your way of life, right? Otherwise, what's the point? Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, Dominique, also our student.
Hello, thank you for lecture. I wanted to ask if you know what Barfield's opinion was about Lewis, as someone who knew him, who contributed to his conversion and observed his Christian path. Maybe Lewis' opinion on Barfield's scientific work was interesting. Just maybe you know something that that cannot be read anywhere.
I think so. I've heard some things. Yeah. So so let me, and I read between the lines sometimes as well. Um, so let me see. I'll start from what I can tell you already know that they were very, very close friends. They met in college, and one of those college friendships that just endures across a lifetime. Forgiving of each other's idiosyncrasies, each other's quirks of personality, and really enjoying each other's company quite a bit. Barfield talks about how much he loves Lewis as a letter writer, that he's in a way a kind of master of the letter as a literary form, full of humor, full of kind of quick-witted, wise allusions to all kinds of things, and a similar kind of generosity. I mean, Lewis became so famous. He had thousands and thousands of people writing to him, maybe not that many, but a lot of people writing to him, and he would answer every one in the same way that Barfield answered me, right? So with the same respect and the same kind of decency and kind of moral uprightness. Quite remarkable. So he enjoyed him quite a bit. And after Lewis died, he wrote some obituaries about him that haven't been collected anywhere yet. So you'd have to go and look at where they were published first. And oh, well, maybe some of them are in Barfield on Lewis. But anyway, and in those obituaries, one thing comes out is how much he enjoyed his letters, enjoyed his humor, and how much he just missed his friend. Right. But that being said, they had many disagreements. And Lewis talked about Barfield as his second friend, which means the first friend is the one who's just there for you, and you just have this great warm relationship, and it's like you're two halves of one person. The second friend is the one who always argues with you, and that's what Barfield was. Barfield dedicated poetic diction to Lewis and quoted one of Blake's aphorisms from Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He said, opposition is true friendship. And that's a good motto for their friendship as a whole. Barfield thought that it was a mistake for Lewis to write his theological books, that because he wasn't an expert in the field, and that the kinds of subjects Lewis was touching on should be left to people who were really experts in the field. At the same time, he considered them extremely well written. And he was asked, why are these so popular? And he said, well, just look at them. Like, they're amazing. You try to write them. They're amazingly well written, entertaining, but also very sharp, thoughtful books. He disagreed with him about a lot of theological points, I think. And it would be wonderful, without picking sides, it would just be wonderful, a great learning experience, I think, to try to discover where their lines of agreement and disagreement are, and then to sort out for yourself, where do I stand, right, in relation to that, as if you're a member of the conversation, right? You're sitting at the table with them, and you're figuring out what you think with regard to these two. I think that might be a great exercise for you. But and he thought that their main disagreement, you probably already know this, was around the status of the imagination. And Lewis thinking the imagination has nothing to do with knowledge. And Barfield thinking quite the contrary, that without imagination, you don't have knowledge, right? That you need it in order to have knowledge. I think that goes into very deep philosophical territory that I tried to get into a little bit today. And so he thought but he thought also that Lewis was a great imaginative writer, so that there's something within Lewis where he's in tension with himself, that with his right hand, so to speak, he's arguing that the imagination is useless with regard to knowledge. And with his left hand, he's writing these imaginative works that are deeply meaningful for himself and others, and how to kind of square that opposition within himself. So he sometimes talks about two Lewises, and that sometimes, like with the Great Divorce, for example, he's able to bring the two together, and that he wished that it happened more often. And I guess one last thing, I don't know if you know about this, there's the Great War between Barfield and Lewis from the late 20s, right up to Lewis's conversion. That was very important for him. And Lewis, after his conversion, refused to talk to Barfield about any of these subjects of theology or the nature of truth or the nature of being or any of these things they had these intense back and forths about. And Barfield tried to keep engaging him in that, and Lewis just said, forget it, I'm done. I don't want to talk about that with you anymore. I think he didn't want to be unsettled any longer by Barfield. And so Barfield waited until after Lewis's death. And then in a very respectful way, he loved his friend, don't get me wrong, there's no bad will. He wrote essays in which he argued with him. And the argument could only happen, though, after Lewis died. So I think it's a very interesting friendship. And in certain ways, he felt closer to Lewis after Lewis's death than he did while he was alive. Yeah, intellectually, because now he could re-engage and continue the conversation that Lewis said wasn't willing to have with him anymore. So I hope that, was there anything in there you didn't know? Well,
Thank you for your answer. I
Okay.
didn't know many of these.
Fantastic. Good. Yeah. There's a book, a collection of Barfield's writings on Lewis called Owen Barfield on C.S. Lewis that collects together much of what Barfield had to say about him. So if you have that in your university library, you can look that up.
No, we don't, but I have my personal copy, so I can
Oh, there we go.
I can
Okay,
lend
good.
it to you.
Yeah, good. And that'll give you a lot to go on.
Okay, so I think it's a moment to end our meeting today. I thank you, Jeff, for a really interesting lecture, which will give us a lot of food for thought, for further thought, and I will also thank the audience for engaging with what our speaker said. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Once
Been a lot
again.
of fun.
Yeah, and next month we will have a lecture by David C. Schindler, Catholic philosopher and theologian, who will talk about Plato's Phaedrus and also the role of intuition and imagination and knowledge, philosophical knowledge. So we will explore further and deeper these topics.
And if anybody has any further follow-up questions, if there's something you haven't thought of now, but you think of later and you want to reach out, Mateusz has my email, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer anything.
Yeah, you can expect a lot of letters and you will have to answer
Good.
all of them.
I will. Yeah, now there's a high bar. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you and
Thank
see you
you
next time.
Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.